Hours went by, and by 3 a.m. on Monday, July 2020, Victoria and Roberto's grandmother pulled up in their car, stopping in the yard behind the workshop. It was pretty clear that both of them had been drinking. Moments later, Sophia stepped out of the shadows, clearly angry. Without hesitation, Victoria's grandmother shot back, "I'm the one who pays for your husband, so I can do whatever I want with him." Hey, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into another shocking true story from around the world. This one comes from Calamba City, Philippines. As usual, it starts with family drama, this time revolving around a son-in-law who can't seem to manage his business properly. But, as the story unfolds, it spirals into something much darker, involving neighbors, secret affairs, and a couple of drunk, love-struck people making some seriously questionable choices. What's the full story behind this mess? Let's get into it and break it all down. Before we get into the story, don't forget to hit that like button, leave a comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Share this story with your friends too. The more the merrier. Now, let's dive in. So, here's how it goes. There's a woman named Victoria, born and raised in the Amadeo area, a place known for its big rice fields and plantations. Victoria's family had been running this land for years. When she was 18, she married a young man, even though her father didn't approve of him. The marriage happened anyway because, well, Victoria was already pregnant. Her father wasn't too happy about it, and for good reason. Her new husband was lazy. He didn't want to work at all, and their lives were basically funded by the money Victoria's parents sent them every month. Even when Victoria's father asked him to help out on the farm, he always had some excuse. Then, after Victoria gave birth to their daughter, Angelica, her husband disappeared. Poof. He ran off and was never heard from again. So Victoria found herself as a single mom, raising Angelica on her own. As time went on, Victoria inherited her parents' land and wealth. She was really good at managing the farms, and with a little help from some workers, she made it all run smoothly. Angelica, on the other hand, wasn't quite as interested in learning how to manage finances or the family business. She'd rather hang out with friends or go out than get involved with the work. Even when Victoria tried to encourage her to go to college, Angelica wasn't having it. She said she was too lazy for school and that she'd probably just end up being a housewife anyway. It was hard to get through to her. Angelica seemed content just drifting along. Then in 2014, Angelica came to Victoria with a request. She wanted to marry her boyfriend, Andres, who was 4 years older than her. Victoria didn't love the idea, but eventually, she gave her blessing. The problem. Andres was unemployed and didn't have any money saved up for a wedding. His family wasn't exactly wealthy either. So, Angelica convinced her mom to pay for the whole wedding. After some back and forth, the wedding happened in April 2014. Angelica was 26, and Andres was 30. Since Andres didn't have a job, Victoria offered him the opportunity to manage their corn plantation. At first, he was on board, but it didn't take long for him to start complaining. He didn't like being scolded by his in-laws and wasn't putting in much effort. He'd show up at the plantation for just an hour and then spend the rest of the day driving around town in the plantation's pickup truck. Sometimes he was given money to buy fertilizer, but instead, he'd spend it on drinking. Eventually, Andres said he was done working there and wanted to move to Calamba, saying there were better opportunities for him. So after their child was born, Angelica and Andres packed up and moved to Calamba in May 2015. But by the end of 3 months, the money Victoria had sent them was gone. They used it all up on rent, and Andres was still unemployed. He couldn't provide for his family. Victoria told them to come back to Amadeo, but Andres refused. Then, in November 2015, Andres had what he thought was a brilliant idea. He convinced Angelica to borrow money from her mother to start a car repair business. He told her that he had the skills and experience to fix cars, and it was something he really wanted to do. After some convincing, Victoria agreed to lend them the money, and they used it to rent a place, buy equipment, and get everything set up. With the help of 2 other employees, Andres opened a car repair shop on Calamba City Road. Well, it turns out Andres wasn't exactly cut out for running a business. Whether it was inexperience, being too trusting of his employees, or just plain bad luck, things started going downhill fast. After just 2 years, the shop was barely hanging on. Tools were breaking down, customers were disappearing, and soon enough, Andres found himself running the shop all alone. Even then, he couldn't fix everything that came through the door. To make matters worse, his capital was running out, and there was barely any stock left. No spare parts, no tires, no oil. But of course, he couldn't afford to buy any more supplies. Frustrated and desperate, Andres turned to his wife and asked her to borrow more money from her mom. But this time, Victoria wasn't having it. Instead, she made the trip from Amadeo to Calamba, ready to show her son-in-law how to actually run a business. She taught him how to manage things wisely, how to handle customers, and how to be a good leader. Meanwhile, Angelica's uncle back in Amadeo helped take care of the farm and fields. Victoria didn't stop there. She bought the land where the workshop was located, built a house, and even started bringing in skilled mechanics to help turn things around. Andres was still in charge, but now he had to work under the watchful eye of his mother-in-law. He wasn't thrilled about it, but he did admit that car repair was his true passion. And it worked. With Victoria's intervention, the business started to pick up again. Customers came flocking in, and soon, the workshop became known as one of the best car repair spots in town. By December 2019, Angelica had her second child, and Victoria found herself busy helping take care of her new granddaughter. Even though she was 50, Victoria wasn't ready to slow down just yet. She met a 47-year-old widower named Antonio, who worked as an auto parts distributor. They started dating, and well, let's just say Victoria's playful side came back full force. She asked her son to teach her how to dress and look more youthful, just for fun. Angelica thought it was hilarious, but she was happy for her mom. After all those years of widowhood and focusing on the farm, it was nice to see Victoria happy and excited again. So every time she went out with Antonio, Angelica helped her mom with makeup and getting ready. Soon enough, Victoria was turning heads. Her flirtatious nature had returned, and the guys around the workshop were definitely noticing. Whether they were sincere or just joking, they couldn't help but compliment her on her looks. Even when she'd come home from the market with a plastic bag, someone would tease her. It didn't take long for her to become the talk of the neighborhood, not just a beautiful woman, but a wealthy one too. Then came April 2020, and like the rest of the world, Calamba felt the impact of the pandemic. Businesses were struggling, and the economy took a hit. But somehow, car repair shops weren't hit as hard. People still needed to fix their cars, even in tough times. Victoria's shop saw fewer customers, but it wasn't anything too drastic. However, not everyone in the neighborhood was doing well. Roberto and his wife, Sofia, were having a tough time. Roberto had lost his job at a bag factory due to the pandemic, and Sofia's pay at the mall was getting cut. They were desperate. That's when they decided to approach Victoria with a request. Could Roberto work at the workshop? They didn't care what kind of job, as long as he could get paid. At first, Victoria wasn't keen on the idea. After all, Roberto had no experience as a mechanic, and she didn't want to hire someone who might just cause more trouble. But then, every time she saw Roberto's smile and those big, hopeful eyes, she softened. Despite the doubts, she decided to give him a chance. She hired him as the customer manager, and just like that, Roberto started working at the shop. As the days went by, Victoria started paying less attention to her boyfriend, Mr. Antonio, and more to her car rides. She'd insist on having Roberto drive her around, often saying she wanted to explore Calamba a little more. Even though Roberto was originally from a nearby village, he'd lived in Calamba for years, so he knew the area better than Victoria did. Wherever she wanted to go, Roberto was always ready to drive, and he did so without question. The job paid well enough to support his wife and kids, which was all he really cared about. But as time passed, his role grew. It wasn't just about being the driver anymore. Roberto became Victoria's personal assistant, running errands and fulfilling any request she had, no matter how small or strange. His job was to keep her satisfied, and in return, he got a steady paycheck. His motto was simple: do whatever it takes to make sure his family had enough to eat. But all of this started to make Sophia uneasy. She barely saw her husband anymore, and when she did, he was either coming home late at night or in the early hours of the morning. When she asked where he'd been, Roberto would give vague answers, something about going with his employer to buy spare parts, or taking her for a walk, or heading to a customer's house to deliver something. Sophia didn't get it, but she went along with it, all the while feeling more and more suspicious. She couldn't help but wonder if Roberto was really still working at the shop or if something else was going on, maybe even an affair with a younger woman. Then, one Sunday morning in early July 2020, Roberto was about to leave for work when Sophia, who had the day off, asked him, "Isn't Sunday supposed to be a day off? Why are you still working?" Roberto's reply was casual: "I'm just going with Mrs. Victoria to buy a bag." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "What bag? Didn't you say you were buying a bag just yesterday?" Roberto shrugged. "I don't know what kind of bag. It's just a delivery job. I'm just following orders." Sophia felt her suspicions grow. Something wasn't adding up. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Roberto still hadn't returned. Sophia went to the workshop to ask Andres if he knew where her husband was. "Oh, it's fine," Andres said. "Your husband and mom are probably out. If they're not back by 9 p.m., they'll probably stay at a hotel." That answer didn't sit well with Sophia. She tried calling Roberto's phone over and over, but he never picked up. By 8 p.m., there was still no word from him. Her texts and WhatsApp messages went unanswered. So she went back to the workshop, but still no sign of Roberto or Victoria. Desperate, Sophia decided to check at Angelica's place, hoping to find some answers. But Angelica didn't know where her mother was either, and when Sophia pushed for more information, Angelica got defensive, saying it wasn't her business. At 10 p.m., Sophia's phone finally rang, and it was Roberto's phone, but it wasn't him on the other end. It was Victoria's grandmother. "Your husband is working. Stop making a scene. Unemployed husbands are a drag. Working husbands are noisy," Victoria snapped before hanging up on Sophia. Hours passed, and around 3 a.m. on Monday, July 6, 2020, Victoria and Roberto finally pulled into the yard behind the workshop. They both looked a little tipsy. Moments later, Sophia appeared from the shadows, furious. "Where have you two been?" she demanded. Victoria, unbothered, shot back, "I pay your husband, so I'll do whatever I want with him." That was it. Sophia, overwhelmed with anger, grabbed the knife she'd been holding and lunged at Victoria. Roberto tried to step in, but he ended up getting hurt in the process. The commotion drew the attention of Andres, his wife, and a few other neighbors. They rushed to the scene, finding Victoria's grandmother and Roberto in bad shape. They were quickly taken to the Columbus City General Hospital, while Sophia was escorted to the police station. 2 days later, Victoria's grandmother passed away in the hospital, but Roberto survived. Roberto later testified that, since he'd started working for Victoria's grandmother, they developed an intimate relationship. He claimed, though, that it was never about love, it was all about the paycheck. The truth was, he had no intention of abandoning his wife. The pandemic had made everything harder, and Sophia's salary had been slashed by 50% due to a slowdown in business. Sometimes, they had to borrow money just to pay the rent. Victoria's grandmother was their only lifeline. Her job was the only one that could pay enough to meet their daily needs and survive the crisis. Roberto had tried to find another job, but with the economy in a slump, he had no luck. He apologized to his wife and family for how everything had played out, especially since it had all become a public spectacle that made him look like he'd betrayed them all for money. As for Sophia, she mostly stayed silent after being arrested, simply wanting to hold her son again. She admitted that her anger and jealousy had gotten the best of her. It turned out her husband wasn't at the workshop as she'd thought. He'd been serving Victoria's grandmother all along. Her lawyer, Manuel, argued that Sophia's actions that night were driven by a surge of raw emotion. He painted the old woman as the real culprit, someone who had stolen Sophia's husband right out from under her nose. Victoria, he said, had been too proud and entitled, thinking that by hiring Roberto, she could take whatever she wanted, even if it wasn't fair. Sophia also blamed Angelica and Andres for not speaking up. They knew what was going on but chose to cover it up. However, when the couple was asked about it, they denied knowing anything. They claimed they had no idea where Victoria and Roberto had been all day. Sophia knew she was facing serious consequences, especially after the prosecutor argued that the knife she'd brought was proof everything had been carefully planned. It was hard to deny. She felt defeated, but when Manuel suggested that Roberto might face charges of misconduct, Sophia refused. It wasn't out of pity for him. Rather, it was because she didn't want their child to grow up without anyone to care for him. Even though her own parents were still around, she felt Roberto was the one who was closest to their son and would be the better parent. The trial was delayed for months due to the pandemic, but on March 18, 2021, it finally took place at the Calamba High Court. The judge found Sophia guilty of first-degree murder. She had knowingly and premeditatedly prepared the weapon with the intent to kill Victoria's grandmother. She was sentenced to life in prison but could be eligible for parole after serving 20 years. The decision sparked protests from Princess Angelica and Amadeo's family, who felt the sentence was too lenient. But when Sophia apologized directly to them, it seemed like the tension eased. There was a sense of pity involved. It was clear that Victoria's actions had been the catalyst for everything that happened. Even Andres seemed to have let go of his resentment toward his mother-in-law. Whether he was just relieved to be free from her dominance or felt his debts had been cleared, no one knew for sure. But at least, with Angelica being her only child, he was likely to benefit from the family's land inheritance. In early February 2022, some shocking news spread around Calamba. Roberto, after leaving his son with his in-laws, told Sophia he was heading to Manila to look for work. But 2 months later, he visited Sophia in detention and announced he wanted to separate. His reasoning? He couldn't handle living alone anymore. He thought it'd be better to stay single, away from everyone, including their children, so he could have some time to reflect and figure things out in peace. In March 2022, with a heavy heart, Sophia reluctantly agreed to the separation, signing the papers. Just a week later, her parents discovered that Roberto had already remarried a woman in Manila. What lessons can we learn from this story?